Hi, in this video, I'm going to just very briefly kind of explain some aspects of what I think is a really important paper in the course, but in the way of thinking about what we're looking at in the course overall, which is Krippner and Hirschman's the category of the person paper. So there's a kind of abstract there, and you can see, I think, if you read this paper, it's kind of touches on many of the important categorical changes that our new kind of data regime brings to the way that we categorize in terms of risk and how this kind of affects our life chances. Um, it's a really interesting paper in the sense that it has a strong sense of history. It kind of delves in to aspects of the insurance and credit industries, kind of two of the main areas where this kind of data-based work is happening, and obviously hugely then influential over our lives, and traces the historical developments from what they point out from class-based systems to attribute-based systems. The key takeout I think they want us to understand here is that the class-based system that kind of gave us a sense of a kind of shared identity, as opposed to the newer attribute system, which kind of gives us a score, fundamentally changes politics. And that's a very broad claim, very important claim. And I think it actually is also makes a lot of sense. Essentially, the way that these categories work is in the class-based system, we have a shared interest or a shared understanding or shared wants and needs and desires or shared position in the world. And this allows you to identify with other people, get together, maybe form identity-based or needs-based groups, and to be able to do a collective politics around that kind of thing. An attribute-based system where we're all kind of given an individual number, less associated with other people, more kind of dehumanized and individualized. This is much more isolating and makes collective action more difficult to organize and to do against, what we're calling the automation of inequality in this course. So this important categorical development, I think, is an important thing to understand in some depth. So what they do in this paper is essentially point out how important the constructions of categories are. And they use a quote here by my favorite sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who, writes about how knowledge of the world, the categories that make it, essentially construct the stakes, the norms, the terrain about how politics and struggles over things can happen, because they essentially define, the norms and the relations and what is to be struggled over and who can do that. So, one of my favorite quotes from Bourdieu is taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. It actually speaks to some of the things in this paper. And he means by that is that, if you meet someone that's dressed a particular way or likes a particular band or tells you they like a particular book or movie, you will then classify them in terms of what you know about those things and how you classify those things yourself. So, for instance, if you see someone, I don't know, wearing thongs and a, blue singlet drinking VB, you might go bogan, right? That's you making a classification. But the classification you make also classifies you, because maybe someone else dressed like that mightn't say bogan. Maybe someone that's more dressed like a hipster will say bogan, and so that classification may put you more in the hipster category. I'm using a very oversimplified example there based on previous research that I've done, but you kind of get the gist, right? In terms of these categories and the kind of what Bourdieu refers to as the stakes par excellence in political struggle, the ability to define categories is really, really important. So we can think about this, for instance, say, in the use in popular media about the notion of the dole bludger. It's, been around for decades. This idea that kind of labels people that are trying to access welfare when they don't have a job as being kind of not trying to get a job, they're kind of bludging or whatever. Now we know that the vast majority, like 99% of people like accessing these systems desperately want to work and don't want to go to Centrelink because it's a terrible experience and don't want to be labeled with that kind of stuff. But what this kind of label does is allow this kind of political representation to encourage people that, don't engage with the welfare system to think of these people in this way, and it allows a kind of room for more pejorative policies and, restricting and all that kind of stuff. The language, the category, does a lot of the political work in creating the the kind of environment to push those policies through. Another example would be something like the use of, when it comes to migration and refugees, labeling things like boat people and queue jumpers that was pretty common a decade or two ago. The idea here that kind of people, fleeing political persecution under the threat of death can somehow orderly form a queue or fill out a form is kind of absurd. But again, if you want to like um, uh, raise up anti-immigration rhetoric, that's the kind of labeling you do. The categories do a lot of the work. Another example would be the kind of the everyday use of the term ethnic in a country like Australia. Ethnicity is a category of, different people's culture and, historical backgrounds. In that sense, white people are an ethnic group. But in the way that ethnic is used in our kind of political discourse, it's never to refer to white people. It's always to refer to kind of ethnic minorities in inverted commas there. And therefore it's doing particular political work in doing that. So the ability to kind of create those categories have fundamental influences on our perceptions. And the paper here today is, I think, really important because it shows the way these kind of data machines and the way that we're categorized within them has changed over time and does this kind of more increasingly isolating and individualistic kind of work. Really affects, as they point out, the possibilities of perception, how we relate to others, and it's that classification itself that fundamentally changes how politics works and what it is. So they talk about the class-based versus attribute-based based systems. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, and I've got some kind of pull quotes here you can look at, but please look at the reading. Essentially, though, class-based systems give individuals a kind of a way of kind of being in a class, a group that makes them the same as the others, and then scores everyone in that group about the same. Assigning individuals to memberships in a group in which each person is positioned as average or typical. So what this does then is put you in a category with other kind of like people, whether that's, say, for car insurance, I don't know, a young male from a working class background from a rural area or that, has never been fined. That'll be a kind of way of assessing, the person's car insurance. But what that is there is kind of an identity-based thing. There's these kind of identity-based classifications that puts that person in that group, and then all the people in that group mostly are kind of offered insurance at about the same level, again, depending on the car or whatever. Importantly, how this changes, though, is that like in the attribute system, it's a much more kind of individually ranked where you're given a score and those kind of shared attributes disappear. So both of the systems estimate risk aggregated through data, in terms of lots of people, but the ranking and the categories that they then produce are very different. So the class-based thing here, you know, uh, as the kind of quote points out, it simply means that the constituent unit of class is the person, a kind of person made up of individual characteristics of age, sex, marital status, yada, 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 rather than those individual characteristics themselves. And this, again, kind of provides a collectivity. Class here, it's important to point out, is just like class, like a category, a group. It's not classes in social class, ruling class, working class, although that could be one of those kind of ways that the class itself is made up. In terms of the attribute thing, though, it's much more about kind of ranking people in an order, the ordinal society. And this particularly, in terms of the way this does, kind of removes notions of fairness and collectivity. And again, this is an important political move here. Move towards what's called discriminant analysis, gives people a score, and does it in this kind of much more individualized way. Again, this is important because of that kind of political analysis. So that moving from the class-based system gives from like an identity, female, rural, no driver training, to an attribute system gives you a credit score. It's much more difficult to kind of find people around to kind of argue against something if it's just based on scores. Firstly, how do you find out about them? You see in the identity thing, it much more relates to the real world in the sense of people who might be around you. You'll kind of talk to them in real life and probably share some of those experiences or understandings of things. When it's a credit score, it's a much more difficult thing to kind of relate to other people through. So one can organise politically around identity and categories, but it's much harder to do. If you've just kind of been given a number, it's difficult to tell what you have in common, and it's even difficult to tell what other people's number is. In the paper, they kind of point out some really interesting examples of this about kind of gender-based inequalities in the way that people could politically organise against some of the categories they were put into in terms of the way that insurance worked. And that resulted in the insurance system changing because of that. So the class-based categories allows us to do that. The attribute-based categories is much more difficult to challenge these kind of categories. They're kind of done in that kind of black box, backroom, algorithmic way. So it's opaque. And despite the fact that they still replicate, gender, class, race-based discrimination practices. So the identity system gives us a way to kind of politically organize around that. The the ordinal kind of attribute-based system is much more kind of isolating. Now, it's important to note that some people um, see actual some potential in those numbers as well, rather than just seeing them as kind of negating forms of politics. There may be ways that they can form new forms of politics. So like any kind of influential paper, this paper has engendered some kind of critical responses. The critical responses aren't necessarily saying what they're saying is bunk. They kind of say much of the argument in this paper makes a lot of sense, but here's some other things to consider and that as well. So I've got some links to that stuff there. I think I've mentioned already that Fourcade and Healy argue that things like ordinal scores may be something that people can politically organise around in the future. Again, I'm not sure about how that would work, but it's an interesting way to think about things. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.